Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to continue our collaboration series. This time we have Guy from Coin Bureau. We've never actually had him on the channel before. It's a pleasure to have you here, Guy. If you guys don't follow Guy, the Coin Bureau channel, I would recommend before you watch this video, go ahead and pause your video, go subscribe to Coin Bureau. You'll find the link in the description below. We'll also put it in the pinned comment as well. He does a lot of great fundamental analysis. They talk about what's going on in the macro, and they really follow a lot of the things very closely and all around the world. So, Guy, it's a pleasure to have you on the channel.
Ben, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me. It's great. I'm a big fan. I've been watching you for a long time, and it's great to have the chance to chat with you about all the stuff that's going on at the moment.
Yeah, so speaking of, the main topic I think that is probably worthwhile to discuss, at least for maybe the first part of this video, are regulations in crypto. And this is something that I've been touching on some recently, and the upcoming regulations. We've mostly spoken, or I've mostly looked into regulations in the United States, but what's going on across the pond, right? We know there are some regulatory uh, things that have been coming up recently in Europe. Would you like to sort of introduce us to what's currently being discussed in Europe, and is the outlook any better than it is right now into the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, the good news is, Ben, in answer to that, in answer to your question, yeah, the outlook in Europe is looking a lot more positive. And what's really heartening is that there seems to have been actual sort of real progress on creating these regulations. So for those unfamiliar, this is the Markets in Crypto Assets Regulation, which is MiCa, is the acronym, which is kind of working its way through the European Parliament at the moment. And we were lucky enough here. One of my research team was lucky enough to be able to get their hands on a kind of draft copy of the bill. So the original MiCa bill appeared a few months ago, and it wasn't great, to be honest. There were a lot of, I mean, there was some pretty crazy stuff in there. You know, they're talking about banning DeFi, for instance, forcing KYC on NFT, on all NFT marketplaces. There was even some discussion about trying to tank Bitcoin's price by crashing proof of work. It was all kind of, it didn't look good. But the bill kind of then went back, and there has clearly been a lot of lobby going on behind the scenes. And I'll talk about who's most likely been doing that lobbying in a moment. But the good news is that the new draft of MiCa is a lot more positive, and a lot of the crazier stuff has just gone, which is a great relief. And it basically looks like over in the EU, and obviously, I should preface this by saying, and when these regulations are adopted, and it's a formality now, they should go through within the next kind of week or so, because they've reached voting stage now, so it's basically about to be voted through. So, and obviously, these rules will apply throughout the EU. So this is all 27 member states, regardless of what individual regulations, individual legislation is happening in particular states. These will apply across the whole European Union, which is obviously a huge market, and it's great news in that respect. So, I mean, yeah, as I say, a lot of the more crazy stuff has gone. A lot of the restrictions around stablecoins have been removed, and this kind of ties into, I think, a lot of the lobbying has clearly been done by certain stablecoin issuers, and I think as we talk through this, it will probably become obvious who those stablecoin issuers are. But yeah, so what we are looking at is potentially some pretty good regulatory clarity for crypto in the European Union, and obviously this is going to be, especially good for institutional investors. and for crypto projects and companies that are looking to build in Europe or to migrate over to Europe if there are less favorable regulations in their home jurisdictions. So I think probably the bill has been drafted with an eye to that as well, because I think there's a real sense that various countries, various jurisdictions are kind of trying to position themselves as more digital asset friendly, as more receptive to crypto, because they're waking up to the potential of the industry. So I think Europe is kind of starting to embrace that sort of philosophy as well. And yeah, so I did a video on this on our channel a couple of weeks ago. As I say, we were able to kind of have a peek at this draft bill, and I mean we managed to extract quite a lot from it. I mean, it was over 1,000 pages long, so it took a bit of reading for the evening. Yeah, it was. Yeah, we had a few of us just sort of poring over different bits, and we were lucky enough as well to have this chap Patrick Hansen, who's kind of worked very closely. He's a real expert on this. He's worked very closely with people who are actively drafting the bill. So he had some really good insights on it as well. And I think a few things kind of stood out for me. Firstly, they've really made an effort to get some classification in about various cryptos. So we've basically got looking at three different types of tokens, as they always refer to them. So we've got the first type is obviously utility tokens. Now that is by far the kind of widest of the categories. That includes everything from BTC, all the ERC20s, and a lot else besides. Then there are asset reference tokens, ARTs, and these are, I mean, the standout one there is obviously DAI, but I think all kind of decentralized stables will eventually fall into that bracket if we do get more decentralized stablecoins, that is. And then the final one is e-money tokens, which is obviously stablecoins, centralized stablecoins. The EMTs is the category. So that's your obviously USDC, USDT, all the others. And again, I think it's really important to remember that I think so much of this has been influenced by these stablecoin issuers. And yeah, so there are a few other kind of takeouts for it. There's a good quote here from the report, which I'll read out. So this is kind of relating to DeFi. Now, obviously, when I mentioned the first draft of MiCa, that was very much talking about trying to get rid of DeFi altogether. In this new draft, DeFi isn't really covered at all. Now, this does kind of suggest that there may be revisions in the future, that there may be further reports on this. But there was an interesting quote here on that. So, quote, where crypto asset services as defined in this regulation are provided in a fully decentralized manner without any intermediary, they do not fall within the scope of this regulation.
I see. So they're excluding sort of this right now, with probably the expectation that at some point they'll provide a little bit more clarity.
Yeah, I kind of got the impression that from the tone of the report, as much as you can from something that's relatively dry, but it did kind of feel like they might be kicking the can down the road on that, because I think DeFi is just so mystifying to so many people, and especially people who are trying to kind of draft regulations around it. So. Yeah, I don't think the EU is done with DeFi in any respect, and obviously it all comes down to what the definition of decentralization, I guess.
Yeah,
but certainly,
I guess it's not always black and white, right? It's not either it's decentralized or it's not. It's sort of like a scale from sort of one spectrum to the other. So what do you define as DeFi versus what do you not define as DeFi? I think that's going to be very interesting to see what they come up with. The one thing I thought was interesting too is you mentioned there's sort of three baskets, right? You have like Bitcoin and ERC20s and all that sort of stuff. And then the other two baskets are stables, decentralized stables and centralized stables. It's interesting because, they've sort of lumped in everything that's not stables, right, into one basket at this phase, which Seems kind of like I mean, like, I guess my first sort of take on that is that it would seem somewhat optimistic for uh, people that are in crypto, because it seems like they're not, at least at this point, they're not, it doesn't really seem like they're cracking down super hard on, the altcoin market per se.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think, I mean, I guess when you try to sort of categorize cryptos, you kind of fall down a rabbit hole, don't you? Because this you can subdivide it into infinite numbers of different categories. But yeah, again, I wonder whether lumping all everything bar stables essentially into the one bracket is again sort of a kind of admission. It's like, we'll probably have to look at this in a bit more detail further down the road. But yeah, it's and again, it's telling, as you say, that everything else is, that they've made this real effort to separate stable coins from everything else. There were a couple of interesting takeaways regarding these asset reference tokens, these ARTs. One that particularly stood out to me was regarding white papers. So any ART, a white paper, it must always include 3 disclaimers. So the first one is the ART can go to zero. The ART may not always be transferable, and the ART may not always be liquid as well. So yeah, I think they're being very careful to get these disclaimers out there. And again, that sort of hints to me that there's unfinished business with those. But yeah, the more I sort of looked through the report and kind of talked about it with the rest of the guys here, it really did seem that stablecoins were the sort of the elephant in the room, if you like. And what's really telling is that after the first draft, obviously, so we've only just seen the release of a euro stablecoin by Circle, and obviously, as as I said when we did a video about this, that was related to the fact that interest rates in the eurozone were negative until recently. So there was no incentive for a euro stablecoin, for anyone to issue a euro stablecoin, because there was no way they could make any money on the reserve assets. And Circle, interestingly enough, sort of unveiled the euro coin just before the ECB hiked rates for the first time. Hiked rates into positive territory for the first time. And make of that what you will. But that was certainly interesting. And there's a lot of references to stable coins in terms of payments, in terms of just how they're going to kind of work into the whole kind of crypto ecosystem there. And again, you get the sense that some people in drafting these regulations, they recognize the potential. Obviously, they're seeing what's happening with the likes of USDC and how that is, kind of subsidizing US government spending to an extent, and thinking, well, we need to get a bit of that, because again, another feature of this bill is very much a sense that they have to protect the euro, which is obviously in a pretty vulnerable position right now.
The utility token. So I know you said that there's now some regulation now with regards to the white paper of these utility tokens, which basically includes everything, right? So I mean, imagine if a lot of these projects that have existed for a while, they're going to have to come forward with some more clear disclaimers, I suppose. Does this also apply? Because I mean, how does it affect Bitcoin and say Ethereum? Some of these other projects that have been around for a while, are they sort of subject to the same exact thing, or not so much the case?
Not so much the case, I think. Obviously, Bitcoin, I think, is very much protected by its decentralization. There's not sort of all that much talk regarding proof of stake, obviously, in terms of relevance to Ethereum. One thing I particularly noticed that was very interesting, again, kind of regarding stablecoins as well, but they're going to be stablecoin issuers are going to be required to disclose any affiliations, any relationships they have with the layer ones that they're issued on. So
I see.
That I think is potentially very, very interesting. And I think, obviously, I think Ethereum is the one that springs to mind there, because that's where so the majority of stablecoin traffic is right now, and is probably likely to stay for the foreseeable future. So yeah, that was an interesting thing to spot, sort of hidden away in the text.
With the stable coins, I mean, this is something. I mean, I know you're probably more aware of this than even I am, because I mean, you talk about this stuff all the time on your channel. But with the stable coins, we've been dealing with stablecoin FUD for years, and it always seems like it shows up in a lot of times. It shows up at the end of bull markets, right? And it certainly gets pronounced in bear markets. I mean, do you see this? Do you see what the what the EU is doing? Do you see this regulatory framework, the MiCa bill that has been put forth? Do you see this as sort of getting us past some of some of these recurring themes that show up like every single year? Such and such crypto or such and such stable coin is not backed, or there's going to be a run on the bank. Do you think that this will help distill some of the fears that crypto investors have had?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. Mainly because there is an acceptance now, certainly in Europe, and I get the sense of this slightly in the US as well, which we can talk about in a minute. But certainly there's an acceptance that stablecoins are here to stay, and there's an acceptance as well, obviously going back to the fact that they have to, if they're properly regulated, if they're centralized, right, then they have a role to play in backing up government debt, in accumulating government debt, and therefore subsidizing spending. And it's particularly interesting in the context of the EU, because obviously the reason why interest rates in the Eurozone have been negative for so long is because of more fragile economies like Italy and Spain, for instance, which just are so indebted that they just wouldn't be able to cope with a rise in rates. And I think there's an acceptance now that if a euro stablecoin is allowed to grow and thrive, then the company or companies issuing euro stablecoins will have to buy debt, and that money can then be sort of allocated wherever in the eurozone it's felt it's needed to go. So I think there's a definite sense that this is something that can be harnessed, that does have a role to play.
It kind of seems like Europe recognizes the potential of crypto, and they don't want to get left behind to some degree. Because I mean, like, this is a huge change from some of the fears that we were worried about not that long ago. It seems like they've sort of flip-flopped to some degree. I mean, what is your take on that? I mean, do you think that is it just lobbying? Is it they recognize that the path they were going down probably would have been a mistake? Sort of maybe akin to if you had done something like ban the internet, right? Like in the 90s or something, like how bad that would have been if something like that had have occurred. And you can even relate it to, say, like China banning Bitcoin mining. Like it doesn't really seem like it's that great of a step for them to make, but they did it anyway. So any insight, and like, what does your gut tell you, or what do you think about their huge pivot to some degree?
Yeah. I think it's a bit of both, really. I mean, lobbying certainly seems to have played a big part here. And again, like, I know I keep kind of circling back to Circle, but their kind of prints are kind of all over this, especially obviously with the euro stablecoin itself. But yeah, I think there is a sense that they are kind of waking up. The problem, and what is surprising, is that one of the most often repeated complaints about the EU is it just moves so slowly because, I mean, as you can imagine, it's a huge body. It represents so many different members' interests. Different languages and cultures, all trying to be governed together. So I must say that I'm surprised in that sense that it seems to have moved relatively quickly on this. But yeah, there's a definite sense that it's like we need to embrace this technology, and I think as well there's so much, I think there's a real awareness that regulatory progress seems to have stalled in the US. So you kind of got the US on the one hand, you've got the likes of China on the other, which have just flat out shut it down. And I think there's a real sense that China has missed out there. And then, of course, you've got these other kind of more nimble entities like Singapore, like Dubai, like Zurich, Switzerland in general, who are making much quicker moves in order to attract the industry. And I think there is a genuine sense that Europe can't get left behind, especially as there is an enormous amount of talent there. There's not only a lot of crypto companies there, but it seems to be there's a lot of developer talent. There's a lot of entrepreneurial talent in Europe that is desperate to embrace crypto and has already contributed a lot to the space. And it's a question of do you want to retain that industry, or do you want to see the brain drain to the UAE, to Singapore, or to the States if they get their house in order?
Well, I mean, I think that's actually a great segue to talking about regulation in the United States. And I mean, and this is something I've thought about before too, is like if the United States doesn't get their act together and figure out exactly what the regulations are going to be, there could be a brain drain, right? Like there is going to likely be a lot of entrepreneurs who just say, you know what, we're not going to sit around and wait for the United States to tell us, what we can and cannot do in the cryptoverse. Like, whether it's a security, whether it's not, whether there's certain regulations we have to follow, whether there's not. These people are going to probably start just moving other places and going somewhere where it's a little bit more crypto friendly. What are your? I mean, I know we just talked a lot about Europe and kind of regulations going on there, but what are your takes on the United States and arguably very slow progress that we haven't really seen a whole lot go on this year. I mean, we did get some type of framework come out recently, but it doesn't really seem like it was that different from things we had already heard. Do you have any key insights based on regulation you see in the United States?
I mean, I think the first thing that kind of springs to mind and is most concerning from that point of view is the SEC, is the SEC stance and this kind of regulation by enforcement, which, as you say, I think is only going to drive a brain drain because people aren't going to. And I think we're already seeing it in to an extent because we've seen quite a few CEOs step down. I mean, Jesse Powell is a good example, but there are others kind of stepping down from prominent positions with crypto companies in the United States. And I think a big part of that is they're kind of looking ahead to the next couple of years and saying to themselves, right, I mean, do I want to spend the next couple of years talking to regulators, having to go and explain myself in front of this or that Senate subcommittee or whatever it is, and try and convince these people, that's too difficult. That is going to be a really long, drawn out process. And I think in a way, you could argue that the brain drain has perhaps started, and it just doesn't help that the SEC is pursuing these kind of cases, and it's also the fact that there seems to be some confusion over which body should be enforcing these regulations or certainly regulate or trying to regulate the space. I mean, the SEC seems to be very keen to do that, but obviously there's the CFTC as well, and a lot of people kind of leaning in towards them being taking a more of a driving seat in that respect. So yeah, I think it's only going to drive people away.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you like. There was some bill a while ago where they for a very brief period of time it looked pretty up in the air for proof of stake mechanisms, and I mean, I even run validators, and I was wondering, I'm like, is this going to immediately affect these validators that I run? That of course would also then go and affect some of these networks, right? If a lot of people all of a sudden have to shut their validators down because of some regulatory risk. And I think that, I mean, it seems to me that both in Europe and the United States, that a lot of these regulatory risks are what is keeping a lot of large players out of crypto, right? Like, I feel like crypto, we're in like a pond, and there's like, we're just not connected to the ocean where there's so much, like there's so much more there's bigger fish, right? There's always a bigger fish. Um, do you think that that's what's keeping? Like, do you think that we're sort of trying to get through that in this bear market? I mean, obviously, this has been a pretty brutal bear market. Not even just for crypto, right? But I mean, for equities and basically everything.
Across the board.
Yeah. I mean, do you kind of see these regulatory risks? Like, these things are sort of gonna, until they, right, until they get really fully resolved, a lot of large players would likely still be somewhat skeptical to come into the space, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, the Tornado Cash sanctions themselves were. I mean, that was a scary time for the industry, because there were all these legitimate questions. It's like, okay, well, if I've received a transaction from a wallet that's interacted with Tornado Cash, am I violating sanctions? It was a valid question, and it's a huge deal for larger players, for larger corporations, because I mean, no one is going to risk crossing that line. No one is going to violate sanctions and get, what is it, 30 years in jail or a $10 million fine. That's just not going to happen. And so that, the threat of that alone, I think, is enough to drive people away, or keep them on the sidelines. And I think there really is this sense. I don't know if you get this as well, Ben, but I think there really is a sense of everyone's just kind of waiting and seeing. And I think we saw that after the merge. I think that was a big deal, a big part of why the merge sort of didn't perhaps pump the markets as many people were expecting, because I think all these institutional investors that we were perhaps expecting would come in sat there and go, okay, proof of stake, it's environmentally friendly, it's ESG compliant, that's great, but until I know that I'm not going to have my operations shut down, or my holdings confiscated, or I'm going to violate sanctions, we're not getting stuck into this. We're not going to invest until there is that clarity.
And it seems reasonable. I mean, even me it seems reasonable. Like, I want clarity on the market. I mean, the idea of say, what was originally in some of these prior bills of having to say like KYC the delegators that staked here. I mean, it's just absurd. Like, yeah, I mean, I would also, I think one thing that would be useful is would be the people that make the bills surrounding some of this stuff. If they had a better understanding of what it is they're actually trying to regulate, I do think that would actually, it would go a long way. I think a lot of times people should probably be a little bit more open to admitting, like, I'm not an expert at this, and therefore, maybe I shouldn't be the one coming up with all these crazy regulations. What do you like? What are some key things you're looking towards with, say, upcoming U.S. regulations? Like, are there any major things you're watching for? Like, I don't know, maybe we could be optimistic and say that the EU is sort of showing the U.S. the path, or what are you looking for?
I think certainly, yeah. I think if once MiCa is in place in the EU and proves its worth and attracts that sort of investment, which I think it will, then I think the US will definitely take a lead from that, because I think that's one of America's great strengths, is that you guys don't allow yourselves to get left behind for very long.
Right.
So I think there'll be that. I mean, really, I think that for me, the really interesting thing that I'm waiting for, regarding US regulations. And I'd love to get your take on this, because obviously you're there and you can read the mood on the ground, I guess. But is the midterms next month? Because I think, this is an opportunity, and I've said this in a few videos that I've done. Like, this is an opportunity to get some of these pro-crypto politicians, some of these people who understand it, the likes of Cynthia Lummis, obviously, she's already there and batting for our side. But, there are people who are taking steps to understand, to figure out what this industry is about. And the midterms is the chance for a lot of them to get into positions of authority and influence. But obviously, there's also this risk of a kind of regulatory impasse, I guess. I mean, I get the sense that the Republicans are very much kind of expected to make gains in November. So will that? I mean, that will presumably kind of jam up any meaningful legislation.
Yeah,
Is that fair to say?
I have a few thoughts about that. I mean, first of all, we do know that at the midterms, the sort of the party that's not in power, they're usually able to reclaim some seats. Even more so, I think, when you're talking about a slowing economy, right, like a recession, that kind of stuff, because people just people aren't always happy when that sort of stuff happens. And this is not party specific. It's no matter which party is in office, if we're in a recession, it tends to swing back the other way. There's actually a lot of different points that I know that you could look towards as to what could lead to more seats for the other player. But yeah, I will say this, I don't think that history will look kindly upon those that are completely anti-crypto. Okay, so the politicians that come out and are very anti-crypto, I don't see how that is going to act in their favor over the next several years. Look what happened in 2021, right? Like, it seemed like almost everyone was so interested in crypto, or at least it felt that way, right? Like, I saw all sorts of famous people promoting all sorts of cryptocurrencies, and it seemed like they were really getting interested into the crypto space. And then it's funny because I walk around my neighborhood and no one seems to care about crypto. So to some degree, I feel like I was living in a bubble, no pun intended, right? I feel like I was living in a bubble to think that like everyone was interested. So I do think that history will not be that kind in terms of votes for that person, for those that are going to remain anti-crypto, because I see this as a really big innovation, and I think it's freeing to some degree, because we're all sitting here in the United States and all around the world, really, and we're watching inflation just destroy us. I mean, it's a tough year, and throughout this entire year, I've sort of marched on with the mantra that cash is king, right? I mean, I guess the U.S. dollar has been king, not necessarily any types of cash, right? I'm just an ignorant American, not thinking about other fiat currencies. But crypto at least offers something different. It offers something different, and I mean, Bitcoin was built out of the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. Okay, it was built out of that, and I understand that it's been hammered recently. But this is how sentiment always is in bear markets, right? And eventually we'll go back to a bull market. And I think people are going to remember the politicians that were kind of against crypto, and to say, you were against this innovative technology. So I really don't think that crypto should even be party specific. I mean, there's no reason it should be. There's reasons for I think both parties, or at least in the United States and all over the world, to embrace it. I think it's just a very innovative time in money in general. And we've seen that. I mean, we saw that in 2019, 2020. A lot of people are just sort of experimenting with money. It's not something that we've had many opportunities to experiment with before. I'm not saying it's never been experimented with, but it's just there's been a lot of experimentation with money recently, and trying to figure out what works, what doesn't work. Proof of stake, proof of work. There's all sorts of consensus mechanisms that we could talk about. But yeah, I mean, I think to get back to your question more so of my thoughts coming up with the midterms, I think it would be a great opportunity for certain politicians to come out as pro crypto, and that will be remembered, I think, in the future. That they could see the potential of crypto even when we were in the bear market in crypto winter. Um, will that be the case? Will all politicians come out and be pro crypto? No, unfortunately not. Right,
No.
and I think these are the risks that we're going to run over the next. Look, there's always a narrative. There's always a narrative every bear market and every winter that we're navigating. But that's sort of the narrative that we have right now. But hopefully, we'll get past this over the next year, and we can go into the next Bitcoin halving, which is kind of conveniently placed in 2024. Hopefully, we have enough time to get through some of this macro stuff, um, and go into another bull market. I mean, do you kind of share some of that sentiment, or anything you disagree with, or what do you think?
I 100% share that sentiment. Yeah, and what's been really encouraging, I think, looking at what has been happening with regulation in the United States, is that crypto doesn't seem to be one. It seems to be fairly bipartisan, and there seem to be people on both sides of the aisle. It seems to be, in a lot of cases, a fairly rare area of consensus for a lot of politicians, which I think is great, because it can be so many things, can't it? You can embrace it from a tech perspective, which might be seen as a kind of more liberal perspective, if you like, although that's a bit of a generalization. Or you can embrace it from a kind of more libertarian, freedom-loving perspective, which I guess is kind of more associated with people on the right. It can be kind of, it is so many things. And I think that's something that a lot of these anti-crypto politicians are kind of grappling with. It comes back to this idea of misunderstanding. It comes back to not really being able to appreciate what this technology is. And I guess with a technology as revolutionary as crypto, and we always use the example of the internet. That's the most kind of salient example, isn't it? It's such a revolutionary technology. It's going to change things so profoundly that you can perhaps forgive a lot of people for not being able to quite get a handle on it. Mm-hmm. Because it's the potential is just you can't see that far. There's so much still to come. And I think as well, I think you're absolutely right in that history will remember those who were anti-crypto. And I think it will be similar to those people who sort of proclaimed the death of the internet very early on. I think as well the kind of whole ESG narrative, I think that will really come back into a lot of focus retrospectively, I think. And I don't disagree with a lot of environmental policies. I'm not in any way in favor of pumping more carbon into the atmosphere or anything like that. But I think ESG has been a really insidious force, and I think it has got its claws into a lot of politicians, both in the States, elsewhere, in Europe and in the UK, all over the world. And I think people will remember that was a driving force and behind a lot of people's kind of anti-crypto stance. And we see it all the time. That it's the same kind of tired old arguments. So Bitcoin is bad for the environment. Proof of work uses the same amount of electricity as name whichever country you want. So yeah, I think it'll definitely be remembered in terms of this kind of ESG sort of fraud that we've been suckered into.
Well, I think too, like I'm with you. I mean, I think like we want to preserve our planet as best as we can. But, even Elon Musk, who is obviously he's the owner of Tesla. I mean, I remember he even put out a tweet where he's like, even as this person who likes electric vehicles, we still are not at the point where we can just go fully 100% into that realm. Like, there are still reasons why we have to rely on other energy sources. But yeah, I mean, a lot of these sort of narratives are recycled time and time again. I mean, I've seen the proof of work Bitcoin country example given out probably since like 2016, 2017. And you're right, like it seems to be, just change the country, and you can make the comparison. But one of the things I wanted to talk about, we talked about this a little bit already, um, and I sort of brought it up a little bit with cash, right, and inflation and the U.S. dollar and that sort of stuff. But some big stuff recently went down in the UK, and the world. So probably putting it somewhat lightly, right? And the world saw what was happening, and we saw the pound fall to like almost parity with the U.S. dollar. It didn't quite make it there. Obviously, the euro already broke parity with the U.S. dollar. So I mean, this still shows a really risk-off time right now in markets, that everything is going down. The dollar is essentially the only thing that's been going up in any sustainable way. I mean, maybe there are some like energy fund. I mean, maybe there's some energy stuff that's gone up, and healthcare arguably is sort of recession proof. But what are your thoughts? I mean, like, what are your thoughts on exactly what went down over in the UK? And maybe you could share, talk about a little bit about what happened for people who might not be aware, and just your take on it.
Sure. Yeah, it's a fascinating situation in the UK. So, I mean, this kind of all stems from, I guess, kind of 3 months ago, Boris Johnson, who was then Prime Minister, he was kind of forced out because for so many things. I think that the particular one was that he hosted parties in Downing Street whilst the rest of the country was locked down. So he was kind of booted out, and we then had this very long and extremely boring process of picking a new leader. And it came down to two. And interestingly, there's a kind of crypto angle here as well, because one candidate was Rishi Sunak, who was until very recently the Chancellor of the Exchequer, so the finance minister. And he has made kind of pro-crypto comments in the past. He clearly understands the technology. He has a sort of, if you like, kind of tech bro background to an extent. So it was him, and then Liz Truss, who ended up kind of winning the race, who has sort of said the word blockchain a few times, because I think she's been told to say that, because that goes down well with certain sections of the electorate. Anyhow, so she was elected basically by a party membership, which is an absolute fraction of the percentage of the country. So she was basically elected by less than 100,000 people. This for a nation of 60 odd million. So, and obviously this small group of people are in no way representative of the country as a whole. But anyhow, so this is a very ideological conservative party now. They're very far to the right. They're very much focused on free markets and growth, which is on the face of it a good thing. But anyhow, so she was elected a few weeks ago. There was then this kind of obviously the Queen sadly died, so nothing kind of happened for about a fortnight. Then things started up again, and they put out this budget, this kind of mini budget to address the cost of living crisis, to address everything that's been caused by rising energy costs and just inflation in general, which is running almost 10% in the UK now. And this mini budget was, as expected, it promised help for people with their energy bills, because people were facing bills that they just couldn't pay. So there's been a price cap put on that, which obviously means, borrowing a lot of money from somewhere, which is not great in an environment where the Bank of England is trying to hike rates. It's trying to sell government bonds rather than buy them. And there was also the kind of headline of it was, not only was there this big energy subsidy, but there was also this tax cut, which was shown to benefit the rich sort of much more than anyone else. And this at a time, when there are food banks across the UK, people are wondering whether they're going to be able to heat their house or eat over the winter. It really is. It's a grim situation over there at the moment. And yeah, so the markets kind of reacted as you might expect. And the extraordinary thing, I think the most extraordinary thing perhaps, was this rebuke that the IMF gave. The IMF rebuking the British government and saying, look, you can't borrow all this money in this sort of environment. Inflation is running hot. You need to get that under control. And of course, the real effects were felt on bond yields. So bond yield, UK government, the price of UK bonds absolutely tanked. The yield went right up. And there was absolute panic in the bond markets. This kind of spilled over into the pension sector as well, which is a £1 trillion+ industry. And so the result was the Bank of England was kind of forced to step in and completely reverse course. So it's now announced, I think it's a 60 or 65 billion basic injection of money. It turned on the money printers once more. And there is almost certainly going to be an enormous rate hike, probably next month, I think, but that may in fact be brought forward. And I guess sort of shortly before we started chatting, there was an interesting development on that. Basically, the new chancellor has kind of rode back, done a U-turn, or as you guys call flip-flopped on it, and reversed this tax cut. But that only accounts for sort of £2 billion of this borrowing. So yeah, the UK is in this extraordinary situation now where it's kind of borrowing more to fund growth. And this is a time when borrowing is the absolute last thing that it should be doing. So, and I guess the real kind of worrying thing, that the pensions, the problems in the pension sector and the gilt market seem to have stabilized, but now we're looking at climbing interest rates, and this is going to really affect people on mortgages. And I think I read in the Financial Times today or yesterday that next year alone, I think 1.8 million UK households are due to come off their fixed rate mortgages, which were fixed very, very low. And so people's mortgage payments are going to, more than double in a lot of cases. And quite how this is a time when energy bills, even though they're being capped, even though they're being subsidized, there's still too much for a lot of people to pay. So quite what happens from here is anyone's guess, but it really doesn't look good. I don't know if that's kind of filtered across to you guys over there, the extent that.
I think some of it seems so very counterintuitive. High inflation, you wouldn't expect you wouldn't expect these major essential bank, you wouldn't expect something like this where they're going back to QE, but it also sounds like they had to, right? Like, well, had to, I guess, is somewhat subjective. I mean, you don't have to do anything, right? I mean, you could let certain things happen, but to a large extent, it felt like they had to do it. And it just seems like you're hiking rates on one hand, trying to get rid of inflation, and then on the other hand, you're going forward with more QE, and so the thing you're fighting over here, you're sort of fueling over here, and it seems very counterintuitive. I think probably the most obvious way that it probably filtered back to the United States is people then just sort of speculating that the Fed is going to do the same thing, like they're going to start a period of QE. I don't really think that's the case. I mean, I don't think the Fed is about to go forward with any types of QE, but they will. I mean, eventually they will, right? I mean, eventually, at some point, they'll have to pivot. I just think I think a lot of people were surprised that the crack, really started to break down as quickly as it did in the UK. What are your thoughts now? I mean, do you think it's have things sort of settled down over there, or is it just a storm coming with all these? As you said, I mean, a lot of people are on fixed rate mortgages. What happens when their mortgage payment doubles or something?
It's such it's a difficult thing to imagine, but I mean, there are sort of there's a lot of rumblings in the UK at the moment. I mean, there's already a kind of campaign for people not to pay their energy bills in protest, which seems to be gathering a lot of momentum. There were a lot of protests in the UK over the weekend just gone, and this is already on the back. I mean, various. I'm over in Dubai at the moment, and I was last back in the UK about a month ago. And I remember sort of just before I left, everyone just seemed to be going on strike. You couldn't get on a tube half the time in London. The trains keep going on strike because, again, cost of living. These people working mostly in public services are just not getting pay rises anywhere in line with inflation, and are struggling to make ends meet. So, I mean, a lot of people kind of talk about a return to the 1970s. I don't know if you've heard the phrase "winter of discontent," but that crops up a lot. Strikes, nothing working, no money around, high inflation, high prices, and it really seems to be kind of going that way. And what's interesting as well is that the Conservative Party here in Britain has always kind of traded on its reputation for sort of financial competence. It's quite sort of fashionable to not like the Conservatives. They're often seen as a kind of nasty party, if you like. But people have been willing to kind of hold their nose and vote for them because they were always seen as being very, very good on the economy. And now that has been completely shattered. I mean, we're still, I think, about 2 years away from a general election, assuming one doesn't get called earlier. So it's a bit early to start talking about a change of government in the UK, but it's very, very difficult to see how that isn't going to play out sort of in the longer term. And yeah, I think that will the Labour Party, which is most likely to benefit from this situation, has got very different ideas about how the country should be and how the economy should be run. So I think we're going to see a lot of changes in Britain, but unfortunately, I think a lot of it's going to be very, very painful, especially over the winter.
Yeah, well, and I mean too, if people are not paying their energy bills, I mean, wouldn't just the response that their electricity gets cut off, or
I think the thinking behind it is that there's a petition, there's a sort of petition going that everyone will stop paying their bills when a million people commit to doing so. And I think they're getting sort of closer to that number all the time. So it would then be, I guess, a game of chicken to see would the power companies cut off a million people from their electricity in the depths of winter, elderly people, young families, etc.
Don't really want to think about that possibility.
It's real brinksmanship. So we'll see. But it really kind of throws into focus. I think you were talking earlier, Ben, about the dollar strength, and how obviously the Fed is raising interest rates probably more aggressively than any other central bank. And I think America has really led the way on that. And I think part of the reason why we're seeing this crisis with the pound and with the euro is because the European Central Bank and the Bank of England have been slow off the mark in that respect. And I mean, what's the sense over there? Is the sense that these kind of aggressive rate hikes, are they generally kind of being accepted as a necessary evil? Are people kind of pushing back against them?
It depends on who you talk to, I guess. I mean, there's obviously the sort of like the debt to GDP argument that they can't go up to high interest rates without severely breaking something. I've been in the camp, honestly. I mean, my position has just been, I've said this for the entire year, that I want to see them remain hawkish for a while, because I see that as the only real way for us to get back to a sustained period of economic growth, is to have sort of the contraction phase that we're having right now. And the reason I say that is, if you go look at the 40s and you go look at the 70s, right, very different times in terms of what we were going through, but the things that are similar are that inflation was running rampant, right? I mean, obviously in the 40s, we had a world war, and I mean, a lot of money printing occurs when you have a world war. With what happened in 2020 and the crisis that ensued, there was also a lot of money printing. Now, if you didn't know what caused it, you might assume it was caused by a major war, right? I mean, and some people might argue that it has been a war. But I view it as this. If you look at the 40s and you look at the 70s, you could say that, look, the stock market, the economy as a whole didn't really go anywhere while inflation remained high. look at the late, if you look at like say like the late 60s to the mid 80s, the stock market was mostly just sideways for like 16 years. I mean, think about 16 years. Like that is a long time. And so for me, when and the reason I think they went sideways is because inflation became entrenched. And you might have, if you've watched any of the the FOMC meetings or whatever where Powell speaks, he often alludes to say we don't want inflation to become entrenched because he knows what happens, right? He knows what would happen if it does. Is you could have stagflation, right? You could have just a very stagnant economy where we're not really moving in any one direction. We're just sort of going sideways for a very long period of time. And really, if you adjust it for inflation, you would argue that the stock market would have just been going down during that period, not even going sideways if it were actually inflation adjusted. So I'm actually in the camp that it makes sense. Like I'm very accepting of it. Because I think it's the way to get inflation down as quickly as possible, or one of the ways to get it down. Obviously, the Fed has control over demand. I mean, they can go through and try to create demand destruction. They don't have any effects on the supply side, though. I mean, like they're not, if there's supply chain issues, they can't necessarily fix that. So I'm actually in the camp that it does make sense to raise interest rates. To the levels. I mean, I probably going to have some terminal rate over 4%, maybe even as high as 5%. I don't know exactly where they're going to stop, but I'm in the camp that it does make sense because I would personally prefer for them to just squash inflation as quickly as possible and for us to get this phase over with, especially as we're also going through like crypto regulation and all this other stuff, right? Like, let's just get this phase over with, and then we can hopefully go through another period of economic expansion after the bear market is over. If, on the other hand, the Fed pivots and does something like the Bank of England, where I do understand like why the Bank of England did it. I'm not trying to say that it's easy to sit over here and criticize things from my desk when I'm not making the decision on it. But I hope that the Federal Reserve can remain resolute long enough in their fight against inflation to actually bring it back down, and we don't flip-flop between QE and QT and back and forth, because that's arguably what happened in the 80s and the 70s, and it took until Volcker came in and sort of manufactured two short but sweet recessions that finally brought inflation back down. So yeah, I mean, but look, I mean, that's my opinion. If you go look at some other opinions, like there is some I think some well-known professor recently that kind of went on a rant about Powell and just the Fed in general, and saying, it doesn't make sense, right? Like the time to do this was last year, when the market was still strong, not to do it when the market is still weak. Because if you go back and look, the Fed usually raises rates in a strong economy, right? Like when markets are going up, and they usually raise them too far, and then it sends us into a bear market or recession, and then they have to pivot. This time they're raising rates, and like inflate, or the economy is going down to some degree. Like the stock market is going down, so it's a very precarious situation indeed. But I mean, that's more or less my take. Obviously, some people think they're doing too much. Some people think they're doing too little. I'm kind of in the camp of I think what they're doing probably makes sense. But certainly they won't be able to carry it on forever. I think the biggest risk is what happens. My main concern is what happens when unemployment finally starts to go up and it really does get felt by a lot more people. And if inflation is still high, what do they do then? I mean, do they just say, all right, we're going to have higher inflation, or do they not? So I don't know. That's kind of my take.
Yeah, I mean, it seems from what we've seen of it over here, it seems like Jerome has kind of dug in on that respect, and is prepared to let the economy crash in order to tame inflation. I mean, do you get the sense there that the Fed has managed to kind of claw back any credibility? Because I mean, it's kind of been struggling ever since they came out and said inflation was transitory.
Yeah.
It's kind of no one seems to have taken them perhaps as seriously as they'd like to be taken. I mean, taken. Do you think there's any sense of that credibility returning?
I think maybe. I mean, it always takes a long period of time for it to return, right? So like when you make such a big policy a mistake to assume, say, inflation is transitory, uh, and to not really raise the interest rates when they should have. I mean, it takes a big. I would say it takes a lot of time to really regain that trust. And I mean, I think a lot of people just haven't trusted the Fed in so long because if you look at the last 10 years, every time they say they're going to do something, like anytime they say they're going to go through with QT or whatever it is, they end up pivoting really quickly once the economy starts to show like any sign of weakness. So usually people call the Fed's bluff. And I think this time they thought they were calling the Fed's bluff again because that's historically what they've done and it worked out really well. But I think the thing that is different today than it has been over the last 10 years is that inflation is high. And so that has kept the Fed doing what they say they're going to do. I would say that, from my perspective, I perhaps credibility could be restored to some degree if they can actually remain resolute long enough to get inflation back down. But who knows? I mean, what happens if a major institution in the United States looks like it's going to go belly up? Will the Fed intervene like the Bank of England did? Because if they intervene and we go through another cycle of bailouts like we did during like we've done in the past, then where's the credibility, right? Like, I mean, do what you say you're going to do and don't bail people out who just were, I mean, it's sort of that weren't planning for it, right? I mean, we actually know there's all sorts of zombie companies that exist that only operate during periods of cheap liquidity. But and those die off, right? They don't really seem to care about those companies dying off. But when it's something big, they can often intervene. So I think a lot of their credibility will be tied to, what they do over the next year and are they able to get inflation back down, or do they flip flop? Constantly, I know we go back and forth on the terminology used over there and over here. At one point, you mentioned Fortnite, and I kind of chuckled. I'm like, that's 14 days, right? That's something we use over here. I had a physics professor once who said that he told us we could use our any unit we wanted to in our answer. And he said that his favorite was someone who gave units of furlongs per fortnight in their answer of some of the homework problems. But yeah, I mean, their credibility, I think, is, at least in the short term, I think a lot of people don't really trust them because of what happened last year. And they're still trying to figure out, like, are they really going to go through with this? Are they? And they've been doing it so far. Okay. And markets are already saying, look, if you go to look to see what the markets are calling for, they're still saying they're going to raise by 75 basis points in early November, which would get the Fed funds rate up to 4% and potentially up to 4.5% to 5% by sometime in 2023, maybe by mid 2023. So I'm interested to see what they do.
Yeah, and I think it'll be a really interesting moment as well when inflation does start to noticeably go down, and will the Fed hold the course then? Because you can imagine that the cries to ease off or will be really loud by that point. But of course, you mentioned the 70s, didn't you? And I think that was the big problem, wasn't it? That they thought they'd got inflation under control, so they eased off, and then suddenly inflation came right back. So I guess that moment will be really pivotal to see. Inflation is going down. Is the Fed going to stay the course, or are they going to flip flop, U-turn, whichever terminology?
And they've said before, like, they don't just need to see it going down, but they need to see it going down in a way that it's actually going to that 2% milestone. Like it can't just remain somewhat sticky. But look, it's been we could we've talked a lot. So we've talked about regulations in Europe. We've talked about regulations in the United States. We've talked about the crisis over in the UK with the Bank of England stepping in and saying, all right, we will come to the rescue. Really, they probably only had not a few hours to spare. We can maybe end on a positive note. So there have been some upgrades recently to some of the to some of the layer ones, and I mean Cardano recently had an upgrade. I believe Algorand as well. I wanted to get your thoughts on that. I know you cover this a lot on your channel. By the way, guys, I mean, if you're watching me and you're not subscribed to Guy here from Coin Bureau, make sure you go do it, because they really do cover a lot of stuff that we don't. So by viewing that channel, I mean, you're going to get a lot more information on a lot of the fundamentals that are actually going on in the space, and not just me talking about how it affects price or how it doesn't affect price. But yeah, I do think this is a great channel for you guys to subscribe to. So make sure you go subscribe if you're not subscribed. But yeah, Guy, I wanted to sort of wrap up here so we can kind of talk more about a positive note before we sign off. What are your kind of thoughts recently on these upgrades? What do you see for Cardano and Algorand?
I think it's really exciting, a really exciting look out for both of them. I mean, Cardano really kind of struggled in the aftermath of Alonso last year. I mean, that was such a disappointment, and I think it was a tough one for the community to swallow. So I think the stakes for Vassal were really, really high. And I think that was noticeable by the fact that you saw, I think Charles in particular was kind of really key, but other developers as well were kind of, I think, really trying to play down the importance of Vassal. And I think for me, that sort of said, yeah, this means it really is important. And the fact that it went successfully, and the fact that Cardano is now noticeably faster. I mean, I went on and had a play around on Sunday Swap and Meld, and the difference really was noticeable. So, I mean, I think that's great news, you know, going forward. Obviously, it hasn't really had any kind of effect on the price because this is a bear market, and you know that's just what happens, unfortunately. But I kind of think as well that's not something to get too downhearted about. I think this is real building for the future, and of course, there are upgrades ahead. I mean, I think, is it Hydra that's next, which is going to really improve scalability even more?
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of upgrades that are coming, but I mean, this is why I like Cardano is because they sort of just, even in the bear market, they keep building, right? I mean, everything else is just a bunch of noise. And yeah, so there should be a lot more upgrades coming. One of the things that I thought was interesting with this hard fork, or with most recent one, is that the price didn't immediately dump after. And that's actually something we've seen after a lot of upgrades with Cardano over the last year. It's sort of that idiosyncratic risk of what's going to happen right after it is a buy the rumor, sell the news. This time it didn't.
Yeah.
So arguably Cardano is sort of settling in to more so whatever the market risk is, right? Rather than its own individual risk. But I do like that it went through swimmingly. And it's sort of like the merge with Ethereum, right? It's great because such major updates could easily come with all sorts of bugs. And to see these upgrades come through and be successful, I think is a really positive thing. And it sort of lays the groundwork for ultimately building out into having more utility and not just sort of chasing trends during a bull market.
Yeah. And I think as well, again, kind of long-term trend-wise, I think investors, particularly, I guess, institutional investors, which is obviously where Cardano kind of, is lacking in that respect. But I mean, I think any investor will look at the likes of Ethereum and Cardano in the aftermath, when interest in crypto returns, if you like, and go, well, these guys were able to execute these big upgrades, and they went flawlessly. And I think that is testament to the caliber of people working on those projects, and that I think will be a big part of people's due diligence in the future. So, yeah, although price hasn't done anything, I think it's really, really positive. For Cardano especially.
Yeah, I mean, arguably, yeah, ADA USD doesn't look that great, but nothing against the US dollar looks great this year. ADA Bitcoin has actually held up better than I thought it would up until this point. Like, its Bitcoin valuation is still doing relatively okay, which I guess is some positive news. But with regards to sort of the Cardano in general, one of the things that I think people should be aware, I mean, like it's been around for a while now, and it's still hanging around in the top coins. Not a lot of coins can say that, honestly. I mean, not a lot can say that.
Yeah.
And I do think that will start to draw the attention of some larger investors. I mean, you're right. The institutional investors they haven't really seemed that interested in Cardano, but hopefully this will be a step in the right direction.
I think so.
What are your thoughts generally about Algorand? So I mean, I'll be completely honest. I don't think I've ever covered Algorand on my channel. I mean, other than in passing, I think I've mentioned it a couple of times on maybe on some live streams and whatnot. I do know they have a really solid team. I've looked into the team before. I think the person who started it, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but isn't he like a professor or something at a? Or am I getting that wrong?
MIT.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, Silvio. Yeah, Silvio Micali. Yeah, he's an MIT professor, and it's fascinating in that respect actually, because there seems to be Algorand is a bit of a rabbit hole at the moment, because they have got this amazing team. They've actually just managed to poach Cardano's, is it CTO? I can't quite remember.
Saw.
I think
Yeah, I did see that. That I don't think that person was at Cardano very long though, were they? I don't think they were, but I don't
I
remember.
can't remember off the top of my head. But yeah, I mean, the Algorand team is not only very capable, but I think it also seems sort of really well connected, because MIT, as I understand it, is supposedly collaborating with the Federal Reserve on this upcoming digital dollar, this CBDC, and I think that that kind of opens up a lot of potential questions around Algorand, because there has been a lot of speculation that Algorand could be the blockchain for for a US CBDC to eventually run on. And there's a really interesting stat that one of my research team dug up, and that's that the USDC supply on Algorand is currently 18 trillion, which just so happens to correspond to the US dollar's money supply. Right. And as the guy said, it's probably nothing. But yeah, I think there seems to be a lot happening with Algorand, a lot going on behind the scenes, a very well-connected project. And obviously the state proofs upgrade that it had last week or the week before, which I think increased TPS to around 6,000. And again, it's a similar thing to Cardano. This is one upgrade of many more to come. So, yeah, Algorand seems to be, there's a ton of development happening there as well. And I think with both Algorand and Cardano, I really get the sense that when the next bull market comes around, that those will be two particular blockchains to watch out for, I think, because I think their ecosystems are still, they're still kind of getting going, really. And I think there could be some really interesting and potentially huge projects on both those blockchains in the future.
Yeah, I think I was just looking at where Algorand is. Looks like it's number 29 right now with a market cap of around 2.4 billion. So it actually is coming in a lot lower than Cardano. So I mean, yeah, like if you're right, I mean, we'll see. I think that I've always had sort of like more of an academic interest, I think, in Algorand, because its consensus mechanism, I think, is more similar to, say, Ethereum's and some of the other ones. My thinking on Algorand is that maybe I think some people some projects probably are better at marketing than others, and maybe that's Algorand's biggest thing is the marketing needs to. But I mean, that's not always a bad thing. I mean, to focus on sort of actually getting a good product first and sort of just, letting other things follow later. Hey, that's not necessarily a bad strategy. One frustrating thing I find in bull markets in general is that so many projects just chase the hype and they chase the trend, and they don't actually innovate. They don't actually innovate anything. They're just copying something else. And I mean, we know it's just a horse race between decentralization, scalability, and security, and they're all sort of trying to optimize these three things. And I have noticed that Algorand, I think, like Cardano, actually, they're not there to just chase the trend, like some are. And so we'll see where it comes out. I mean, I have kept a sort of a one eye on it, so to speak, because I really am interested in getting alts again before the next bull market. I'm trying to figure out the exact timing on that. It's always really tricky. I started my YouTube channel, by the way, in mid 2019, so it was like the perfect time to start. In hindsight, right, it was the perfect time to really start into the altcoin space. But Um, any final thoughts on Cardano and Algorand as we sort of sign off here?
I think just, yeah, going back to what you were saying, Ben, I think both projects have a very good sense of what they're about, and I think they both have very strong communities as well. And I think I think both of those, plus all the development that's going on both, and they are both very, very well funded. I think I think that bodes well for the future. And as you say, like it is just not altcoins time at the moment. But I think it's still really heartening to see that even in this climate, even with interest rates climbing, even with inflation seemingly out of control across half the world, even with all these really tough things still going on in the wider world, in the global economy, there are just so many potential black swans. There are so many, things that are just not optimal at the moment. And yet you've got projects like this just building away, just getting on with it. And that fills me with confidence. I think there are better times ahead. We've just got to stick them out, these times out for a while longer.
I think developers prefer these kinds of times actually, because you don't really always like all the noise that parabolic prices bring, because then it brings so many people into the project, which is a good thing. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. But then I think that as someone who might be trying to develop something, it's easier to do so when you're in a bear market, right? Like as I say, right? Bear markets are meant for building, and I mean, arguably that's what Cardano and Algorand are doing. I mean, obviously a lot of other projects are as well. We just had the merge for Ethereum. We've seen this before. I mean, you've seen this before many times, I'm sure. We've seen the bear markets. It always feels like it always feels bad. It seems like nothing's ever going to recover. And then you sort of blink and a couple years go by and then everything is sort of recovering and off to the races once again. Hey, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show. I mean, we talked about a lot of stuff, regulations, stuff going on in the UK, touched on a couple of altcoins here. Just one more reminder to everyone. Go subscribe to Guy. He actually gave me a shout out once, and my social statistics look really weird because it's just flat, and then in one day I gained like 10,000 subscribers. after
well, Ben, I've been a fan of yours for ages, and it's a real pleasure to come on and chat with you, and I really hope we can do this again. Maybe maybe you can come on our channel in the future, and we can have another discussion, because there's so much to talk about. And again, that's what's so amazing about the space. A few months down the line, a few weeks even down the line, there will be so much more to discuss. There'll have been so much progress, good, bad, indifferent, whatever it is. So yeah, I really hope we can do this again, Ben. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe a good time for you to come back on my channel. We'll maybe be in a few months once we see any type of progress on the regulatory side, whether it be in the EU or whether it be in the United States, just sort of talk about that. But everyone here, thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe to me, subscribe to Guy from Coin Bureau, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye.